Last month, I unboxed and reviewed the new base model iPad for 2021, and I was surprised by how much value was surprisingly, uncharacteristically placed into such an affordable Apple product. Now, having used this thing for quite a while, it got me thinking, is a $300 iPad a better buy than a used $300 Mac? Well, today we're going to find out. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel for more videos like this, and let's get started. So my first thought last month when I unboxed this thing was, wow, why is this so good? Like, it has no business being this well-rounded of a product without additionally having anything exciting about it. So it's weird to see a product like this, which is not just cheap by Apple standards, but cheap by tablet standards. I mean, you go on Amazon, you go on Newegg, you go wherever, find me a $330 tablet that is a better all-rounder than this. I guarantee you won't be able to find one. And that's what's so weird about this thing. Apple is really good at strategically withholding features and making sure that you have to pay up if you want to get the latest and greatest. They're also known for being infamously slow to update their designs. Now, clearly with the base model iPad, the last part is still true, as this is essentially the same chassis as the original iPad Air, which came out all the way back in 2013. The display glass isn't laminated, as it's been on almost all iPads since 2014, so there's a noticeable air gap in the display. The bezels are giant, and it also doesn't have quad stereo speakers, or even any stereo speakers to speak of. But while it may look old, under the hood, Apple has given it a surprising array of very modern features, from True Tone to Center Stage to the A13 Bionic chip, a chip that still puts Android phones to shame and scoffs at many low-power, even new Intel laptop chips. This is a feature-packed little device, and it got me wondering in my previous video, once I slapped on a $40 used keyboard case, is this, at around $370 all in, a better buy than an equivalent used Mac? When most people discuss the iPad versus Mac topic on YouTube, they tend to be looking at much more expensive devices. But if you're looking much further down the totem pole of pricing, below the point where an iPad is price competitive with a new Mac, the issue becomes a lot more nuanced. But what Mac can we actually buy for well under $400? Well, let's find out. Okay, so here it is. Let's see what $350 gets you in MacBook land. So the biggest gamble that we're taking here is on the condition. I really don't know what it's gonna look like. Honestly, a lot of similarities between buying a cheap Mac and buying the base model iPad. Here, we don't have a charger. With the base model iPad, we don't have a keyboard, so I would definitely pick up a used Apple charger for this, and likewise, I would pick up a used Apple keyboard for the iPad. So here we have it, the 2014 MacBook Pro. So upon first glance, condition is pretty okay. We've got some internal labeling stickers here from the seller that are saying that we have a mid-2014, we've got a Core i5 4278U, 8 gigabytes of RAM, 256 gigabyte SSD, Iris graphics with Big Sur installed. Let's go ahead and open it up and see what it looks like on the inside. Pretty good. I don't see delamination on the display. That is honestly the most important thing, because a lot of the cheap Retina MacBook Pros will be cheap because their displays are completely just a disgusting mess. We do have a fair bit of dirt in between the keys, so definitely could use a cleaning there. Let's see if we have a battery. Yes, we do. Let's go ahead and fire it up. And just like that, we are all set up and signed in, and everything looks pretty good so far, I have to say. Let's check the cycles on the battery. That's another thing that could have an impact here. 479, not particularly high. It's showing as normal condition. Obviously, we can do some more digging to find out if there's anything else there, but this looks like a pretty average MacBook Pro. Let's get this thing cleaned up. So what we have here now are two price comparable Apple products that can easily be had for sub $400 without too much fussing around. But it's hard to imagine two more different devices. One, a 13-inch Pro notebook designed to be a productivity powerhouse. The other, an inexpensive tablet geared towards basic tasks like video calls, mobile games, and the like. But the years have not been so kind to the aging Intel processor, whereas they've bestowed the entry-level iPad with many upgrades, making these two a lot more similar and comparable than you might think. First off, it's no secret that the Haswell dual-core i5 is not bound to be a powerhouse, but I don't think most would be able to predict just how badly it stacks up against a 2-year-old iPhone chip. In Geekbench 5, the MacBook is absolutely buried by the iPad, both in single-core and multi-core, and in the Metal Compute test, the ancient integrated graphics are once again embarrassed by the previous gen iPhone powerhouse. It's not even a little bit close, and it's really indicative of how much of the comparison goes. The MacBook may run macOS, an undeniable advantage for casual use, but its aging hardware undermines that and forces reconsideration. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this MacBook is unusable. That would be both wrong and hypocritical, because I have made literally dozens of videos over the years talking about computers much older and much slower than this one. Not to mention that this 2014 isn't really all that different from the 2015 13-inch MacBook Pro that I started this channel with. But despite that, we'd be kidding ourselves if we tried to argue that the MacBook doesn't feel its age. Fan noise, lagging animations, pretty crap battery life, RAM that fills up rather quickly, and a CPU that just runs out of steam when you throw too much at it. To Apple and Intel's credit, for being such a weak CPU, it doesn't feel as slow as you would think it would looking at those benchmark results. But the snappiness expends itself once a number of applications are open. Final Cut Pro, for example, that's an application that you can at least open here that you can't on the iPad, but it's not going to get you as far as you might hope. While the performance in the timeline is going to be passable, if you're working with 4K footage, you start applying color grading, titles, and transitions, you're gonna bring this thing to its absolute knees, and let me tell you, it's gonna get there screaming and howling. This is really such an interesting comparison. We've got macOS versus iPadOS, we've got new versus old, we've got Intel versus Apple. There are so many things going on here that I felt like in order to visualize this, we need a pros and cons list. First off, it's brand new and it has a 1-year warranty. That alone is huge, but it also means that we can add Apple Care and extend our repairs and coverage for even more years. Speaking of years, we can expect outstanding software support. Whereas the MacBook Pro has already been dropped by Monterey, we can expect 6 to 7 more years of software support for this iPad. Not to mention the fact that the iPad is significantly more powerful than the MacBook Pro, and with that comes much better battery life, as well as much better thermal management with a fanless design. And of course, in 2021, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the camera is significantly better. We have center stage, 12 megapixels. It's absolutely phenomenal compared to the 720p camera that you'll find on the MacBook Pro. But not everything is sunshine and roses with this iPad. There are some areas where the MacBook is noticeably better. The iPad, for example, is much less comfortable to use on a lap. It has a wobbly keyboard and display that you can't adjust the angle of. The keys are also much less responsive and a lot less fun to type on than the MacBook Pro. We also have a noticeably smaller display. With the Apple keyboard, we don't have a trackpad. You also can't deny that iPadOS isn't as fun to use in multitasking situations, and we don't have Windows support unlike this Intel Mac. And finally, there's app support. You're not able to run Final Cut Pro or a lot of other desktop productivity apps. So that leaves us with a really interesting dilemma, because over here we have application support, easy but not necessarily smooth multitasking. And over here we have software support for years to come, warranties, a brand new device with much more powerful processor and better battery life. Which of these do you choose at this price point? Well, at the risk of sounding like a cop-out, I think they're both valid for different situations. For example, if you have a ton of files and documents, the fact that you can upgrade the SSD in this MacBook Pro is potentially invaluable. Yeah, it's 256 now, which is already 4 times the storage that this iPad has, but you could put a 2 terabyte SSD if you wanted to in this thing. Conversely, it's already no longer supported by macOS, which means that every year that passes, you're going to be losing features, getting further and further behind. Whereas this iPad is going to be supported for 7 more years. You can go back and forth on this all day long. This has a bigger display, but this has a touchscreen and True Tone. This has Apple Silicon, which is much more powerful, but this can run Windows if you need it. The list goes on and on and on. So it's impossible to say conclusively whether this iPad is better than this MacBook, because you could very easily have some particular aspect that rules it out. But the big question of this video isn't, is this iPad objectively better, but can it replace a cheap Mac? And to that, the answer is absolutely. This iPad, and iPads in general, have progressed a lot in the past 5 or 6 years since this thing was new. Back before iPadOS, I actually had the original iPad mini, and then I had the original 9.7-inch iPad Pro briefly, and both of those devices were nice, but they didn't really seem to justify their existence with their functionality. But now, particularly with cheaper iPads, running iPadOS, keep in mind, this is the same iPadOS that you would be paying $1,400 for if you go for a fully loaded M1 iPad Pro. This is the same exact operating system. And down here, it absolutely feels like it can replace the level of functionality that you would actually be able to get out of this MacBook. Now, personally, I have to say, if I were to pick one of these two devices that I had to use as my sole device, or at least my primary, I'm kind of leaning a little bit towards the Mac, just because I think macOS is better, frankly. I use iPads all the time, but I always find myself running back to the Mac, even just for basic browsing things that you could do on a 12-year-old MacBook Pro if you wanted to. Just the layout of the operating system, being able to open up a billion windows and just kind of move them all around freely. It's just more intuitive. It's what I'm used to for like 15, 16 years. And in my opinion, there's really no replacement for macOS. But with that being said, I can absolutely see how this iPad could replace macOS if you aren't as ingrained or as tied to it as I am. But really, as with most comparisons, it's hard to say definitively for you which one would be better. So I am curious if this video helped make a decision or opened your eyes to the potential of using an iPad as a primary. Do let me know in the comments down below. And with that, I'll see you guys in the next video.